Good morning. Good morning. I am Jim Thomas, a member of the congregation, and I've been asked to say a few words about this holiday with a funny name, Juneteenth. We'll have to go back to the summer of 1862. Abraham Lincoln was having a terrible summer. The Civil War was not going well for the North, and he needed to find some new ways to have strategies that would help the great army of the North. He knew that the issue of slavery could help to break the South's attitudes. He knew that if he ended slavery in those states that had seceded from the Union, that he would have to free the slaves first in Washington, D.C. He said, how can I free them elsewhere and have a senator down the street with a servant? And so he freed first the slaves in Washington, D.C., effective January 1, 1863. And then he turned his attention to all those states that were fighting against the Union. All of those states that had seceded from the Union. And those states, he said, those slaves will be free. Didn't free very many slaves, but those that heard about it dropped their tools and self-emancipated. Texas, being so remote, was the last state to even hear that the war had ended. There were some battles that even continued in Texas after 1865. But in June of 1865, after Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson had become the president and dispatched General Granger to Galveston, Texas, to inform them all of their slaves had to be let go. You need to tell them they're free. And so the slaves knew that it was June, and they thought that it was after the 12th and before the 20th, thus teenth. So Texas, 2.5 years after their slaves were to have been freed, and after the close of the Civil War in June of 65, they were finally free. You'll get some other tie-ins today of why it is important to talk about that on Juneteenth and the tie-in with Eighth Principle. Thank you so much.
As we light this flame of hope, may our congregation become a kaleidoscope of souls and people.
In the presence of this flame, in me, in you, in us, is an invitation to sit at the table.
May we tend our soul fire through these challenging and trying times to open the hearts and minds of all who enter our doors.
Good morning. Nice to see everybody here today. How's the mic for everybody? Okay? Too loud? Okay. Just let me know. This morning we're going to tell you a little about our Unitarian Universalist faith dealing with racism over the years. We, as a result of it, a lot of Unitarian Universalist members, congregations, have put forth an 8th principle to the 7 that we have. And it is, the principles are part of the bylaws of the Unitarian Universalist Association. So just a couple of, if we use the words UUA, it is Unitarian Universalist Association. And if we use the words BIPOC, stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. So if you just take a quick look at the second page of your order service today, you will see the 7 Unitarian principles, and we couldn't print it in red for you, but the 8th principle, of course, is proposed. And so the principles are not dogma or doctrine, but they're a guide. And the 8th principle would be journeying toward spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions to accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves, in our institutions. So members of the Allies for Racial Equity group today are going to present you some information about the 8th principle, and we'll provide some time actually for people to meet a little bit later in the week if you'd like to have more conversations. So, Unitarians originally were largely from New England European elite. They often didn't treat Native American peoples well. They benefited from slavery, many, and some were leaders in the eugenics movement, which promoted birth control for people of color because they were inferior. Some Unitarian and Universalist ministers preached against slavery, but in the denomination itself, the UUA, not a lot was done. As a matter of fact, some of the leaders were slaveholders. So in the civil rights era of the 60s, the General Assembly, which is like our national conference of Unitarian Universalist congregations, pledged $1 million to Black empowerment projects. In 1970, the funding was totally ended due to the UUA finding they had a large debt and they could no longer continue the program. There was a lot of conflict and controversy at that time, and many Black Unitarians left the denomination. Then there was a period of silence around racism until the mid-'80s. And then in '83, the General Assembly voted to request the UUA board to propose a new study with staff and funding to bring in a fresh approach to racism. The study found that in UU churches and in the UUA itself, overt acts of discrimination, discouragement, and rejection were well documented. It wasn't until 1992 that the UUA and the congregations once again took up the issue of race. For a 5-year period between 92 and 97, congregations studied and subsequently passed a resolution to become an anti-racist, anti-oppression, multicultural organization. They were given a budget, staff to carry out the work, and access to any UUA resources that they needed. However, funding and support started to wane in the 2000s. The accountability mechanism failed, and the focus for the next decade was on shallow diversity, not deep cultural change. The urgency of addressing racism in the UUA and in our congregations rose again in 2017. BIPOC members charged the UUA with biased hiring practices that did not include them and people who look like them. Amid the fallout from a time of great controversy, the president of the UUA stepped down, and the UUA commissioned a study called Institutional Change in the UUA. This was actually presented to the General Assembly in 2020 and is on the Allies shortlist to begin work on. So why should we single out racism? The UUA has done a good job with women and LGBTQ people in leadership and staff positions. As a matter of fact, half now of the Unitarian ministers are women. However, we haven't done as well integrating BIPOC people into staff and leadership roles nationally or locally. Systemic racism, structural racism, institutional racism, which all mean the same thing, continues. To be successful in eradicating racism, the color of justice needs to undergo radical change in this country. Besides being twice as likely to be killed by police, Black Americans are more likely to be stopped by the police, detained, and charged with more serious crimes and sentenced more harshly. Black Americans are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of white Americans. This results in families with no one to care for them because with bail, cash bail is out of reach for a lot of folks of color. So they have to be detained. They're not allowed to go free if they can't post a bail, as often tears apart families, creates a difficult time for many in our society. Nationally, 1 out of 81 Black Americans is serving time. Black people have been killed by the police and has galvanized support from Black Lives Matter. We all know those names: Freddie Gray, Eric Gardner, Breonna Taylor, Daunte Wright, George Floyd, to name some. 9 African-American churchgoers were gunned down in 2015 in Charleston by a white supremacist. This year there was an anti-Asian shooting at a Taiwanese church in California. And in Buffalo, white supremacists walked past white shoppers and killed 10 people of color, Black people. Prejudice, discrimination, and hatred by white people toward BIPOC people is alive in this country, and we know it. And each one of us who is white needs to talk to our friends, our neighbors who are white, and demand that they change their behavior, speech, our actions. Dismantling white supremacy is critical to eradicating racism. I end by this question from another era. If not us, who? If not now, when? When?
Thank you. That was great. Oh, wait. All right, I am going to talk with you about the origin of the proposal to have an eighth principle. Paula Cole-Jones, who is a respected longtime UU leader, started thinking about the existence of a paradigm within UU circles. One, the UU 7 principles, and two, beloved community as seen in deep multiculturalism. After working with congregations on these issues for over 15 years, she realized that a person can believe they are being a good UU and can follow the 7 principles without thinking about or dealing with racism and other oppressions at a systemic institutional level. Our 7 principles, as Rita mentioned, are not dogma or doctrine, but a guide for those who choose to join and participate in UU faith communities. The first 6 principles were initially created when the Universalist Church of America and the American Unitarian Association merged in 1960. In the 1970s, the women's movement spread, and a grassroots effort emerged to revise the UU principles. It took a few years, but in 1984, the 6 principles were revised with gender-neutral language, and a 7th principle was added. This happened when environmental awareness reached a critical mass. Many UUs believe that today we are approaching a similar critical mass, a level of awareness, with a systemic racism in all areas of our lives, personal and institutional. The UU principles were designed to be dynamic. The 8th principle came from a belief that we need to do something now to eradicate racism. Decades of previous commitments made have not achieved success. We need to hold ourselves accountable and to fulfill the potential of our existing 7 principles. Our existing 7 principles imply this 8th principle, but do not explicitly hold us accountable for addressing racism and intersecting oppressions directly, especially at the systemic level. The Black Lives of UU Organizing Collective urges the best way for us to truly support racial equity in a significant way is to purge ourselves and our institutions of the culture and exclusive practices of whiteness and white supremacy. For people identified as white, it is too easy to ignore these issues, which is exactly what keeps the system of racism in our society alive and in fact worsening right now. We need to decenter whiteness and other dominant cultures in the UUA and in UU congregations. The 8th principle is a call to action to stand up for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and to work to accountably dismantle white supremacy both within our denomination and in the wider world.
Two additional pieces of the proposed 8th principle are the inclusion of beloved, community, and accountability. Let me share their meaning. What is beloved community? Beloved community happens when people of diverse racial, ethnic, educational, class, gender, abilities, sexual orientation, backgrounds, and identities come together in an interdependent relationship of love, mutual respect, and care that seeks to realize justice within the community and in the broader world. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's beloved community was a global vision in which all people can share the wealth of the earth. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because international standards of human decency will not allow it. Our UUA president, Susan Frederick Gray, defines our beloved community as the community that practices a radically inclusive and compassionate, anti-racist, anti-oppressive, multicultural, multi-generational faith within, and acts powerfully in partnership and solidarity for justice and liberation beyond. What does it mean to be accountable on the journey to freedom to achieve the promise of America and our Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal? It is important for us to be accountable to those within and beyond Unitarian Universalism who are people of color and others suffering oppression. An accountable relationship is a relationship between equals that recognizes everyone's inherent worth and dignity. Just as the seventh principle reminds us that we are not only individuals, but part of an interdependent web, the eighth principle calls upon us to address the systemic, institutional nature of racism and oppression. Racism thrives when we are fooled into thinking that it is primarily about individual thoughts and feelings instead of about structures and systems. Even if none of us harbors a racist thought, only when we root out the ways racism has been embedded in our institutions will they stop marring the lives of Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. The proposed edition of the eighth principle means we commit to take actionable steps to build effective mechanisms and structures to ensure that racism and other intersecting oppressions are dismantled.
So I'm just going to say a couple of words about next steps. One is that our congregation will have an opportunity to vote on whether or not we endorse the eighth principle. The Unitarian Universalist Association Board will meet next January. They will take this up. If they move it forward, which I imagine they will, it will go to the General Assembly June of 2023. If the delegates pass it in June of 2023, it has to go back to the next General Assembly in June of 2024. To say that this is a very old organization, Unitarian Universalist Association, and a lot of these older organizations have a lot of bureaucracy they are bound up in. It certainly seems like something that should be able to happen sooner, but this is the way it works for now. On Tuesday, I will be here along with anybody else that can be from 1 to 2. If anybody wants to come, either all you on Zoom, if you want to chime in as well, to talk about it. And also, we'll have a Zoom from 5:30 to 6:30, that's Tuesday evening, to also engage some conversation about it. The parish committee has not set an congregational member meeting yet. We will. Thank you for participating, and I'll turn it to Laura.
Hello everyone, I'm Laura Pacheco. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Alex's daughter. First, I would like to wish all fathers in here and on Zoom a happy Father's Day, especially to my dad. And I would like to share with you these words of wisdom. Slaves were set free without a dollar, without a foot of land, and without the wherewithal to get the next meal even. And this too, by a great Christian nation. This was said by H.C. Bruce. I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. I believe the unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you.
If we will remain seated during the postlude, I am going to go up the ramp and look out the door and see what the weather is doing. And if we can take food outdoors, Bill is going here. It's not good out there, Bill just said. So then we will have some refreshments, light refreshments afterwards, but let's stay seated during the postlude. Thank you.